Greetings, everyone. My name is Wendy Osborne. I'm a senior consultant with IAVE, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this autumn series of webinars from IAVE. Bit of a special series that we have over the next 4 sessions, because we're asking for leaders for volunteering from academia and practitioners to share their views and topics on some very important issues. Those of you who may recall that in 2022, the IAVE World Volunteer Conference was in Abu Dhabi. And it had the theme of volunteering for the common good, making life better for people and communities. And we're picking up a little on that theme, reflecting on it in relation to the whole theme about the common good and what does that mean, and where are volunteers and volunteering within that. But then we're also looking forward. Hopefully you will have seen the save the date for the 2024 World Volunteer Conference, which is in Busan in South Korea. And the theme for that conference is People Power, Creating a Sustainable Future Through Volunteering. So we're both reflecting on the topic that was there for 2022, but very much looking forward to the 2024 theme and thinking very broadly about where volunteering is placed within the global dynamic of creating a sustainable future, which is very important to all of us, wherever we're based and wherever we live. The United Nations, for their International Volunteer Day in 2022, and the United Nations volunteers said that volunteers drawn together by solidarity develop solutions to urgent development problems and for the common good. And we've asked our presenters to look at what they feel are some of the sustainable development goals that are important to them and where they feel volunteers can make an impact. And more importantly, looking more broadly at how can we create that enabling environment that allows volunteering to flourish wherever it's happening in the world. I'm delighted that as well as having 4 very key presenters over this series, we also have 4 guest moderators, experts in their own right, volunteering leaders, and they're going to help facilitate the conversation with the presenter about these very important topics. Our first moderator today, I'm glad to say, is Sonia Fernandes. And Sonia is a Portuguese social entrepreneur, author and consultant, a friend and well-known to IAVE. She is co-founder of the Portuguese Volunteering School, an association created in 2008, and the creator of 4 Steps training methodology for volunteer managers. Now, Sonia's organization, Pista Magica, along with their work in relation to capacity building, specializes in developing social innovative initiatives using volunteering as a tool for inclusion. So both Dr. Jacob Mwathi and Sonia have a great deal of experience and expertise to share today. And I'm delighted to welcome them both to this webinar and to start this very important IAVE series. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I am delighted to be here with you. IAVE is my home, and I have the pleasure to be here with Dr. Jacob Mwathi. He is the Deputy Director at the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment and Associate Professor at Wits Business School, South Africa. His professional experience spans over 20 years of work in civil society, academia, and consulting in various parts of the world, including Africa, Asia, Pacific, and Europe. His research interests are centered on power, civic agency, volunteerism, and philanthropy. He will talk about the role of corporate volunteering and how to create a sustainable futures for Africa, a great issue and challenge to start our thoughts on this leadership series. We encourage you, the audience participants, to pose questions and to write them on the Q&A. You can write them while Dr. Jacob is doing his presentation, and after I will be posing him the questions that you are here writing on the Q&A. Dr. Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sonia and Wendy, for the opportunity. First of all, Wendy I don't think it's always the case that you get to work with someone once and then you find yourself having to to get back again and be invited to do some of these things. Sometimes you work and then never get the opportunity again. So thanks a lot to you personally, but also to IAVE, and then to Sonia for moderating this session. But more importantly, I think for the audience, which I hope we'll be able to engage with. When they asked me to speak to this particular element, initially I think the idea was that we do it a little early in the year. And I think many of the speakers that are going to be in this particular series either were unavailable, including myself, or I was the only one who was unavailable, and therefore I suspect there was a lot of ugly to ensure that we can all be available to do this. So I think those that are coming after me and everyone else involved, thank you for the flexibility to accommodate this. But also, having been asked to speak to something as important as creating sustainable futures, I don't think it's easy. And I approached it from something that has been relatively ignored in African scholarship on volunteerism. I think much as we talk about the classic cases of examples of neglect of volunteerism research on the continent, I think we have more gaps, so to speak, or areas that we need to know about corporate volunteering on the continent. And this is especially important if we're talking about the issues of partnership in delivering sustainable development goals. So I thought that part of the work that I had done for IAVE 2 or 3 years ago at the peak of COVID might be useful. And part of this work has appeared in the recent IAVE publication on corporate volunteering across the globe. So next slide, please. So I've said already that in terms of background, we have very few studies on corporate volunteering on the continent. But I think a further challenge that we have on this particular matter is that even when they do occur, or when we have studies, these are not necessarily either in terms of scope, they do not necessarily give us room for comparative perspectives. And therefore, we end up in a scenario where we do not necessarily know much about employee volunteering in general. And in some cases, I think until this IAVE publication, we really didn't know exactly what is happening with regards to corporate employee volunteering and its contributions to sustainable development goals. But more so, there are also questions with regards to, does sustainable development goals even influence corporate employee volunteering? And by this, we are trying to get to whether SDGs do influence companies in terms of the design of their corporate employees and the things that they do. So we're hoping to answer that particular question. And then the next question is also whether or how corporate volunteering is creating sustainable futures for Africa. Broadly, though, the main question and then the other two are what I hope to answer. And you can go to the next slide, please. And in answering this, the study that I'm speaking to here took two different methods. One is a desk review, where we review literature, especially drawn from corporate social responsibility reports of companies, of publicly listed companies in various countries on the continent. One of the things that we find, and I'll be speaking mainly around 3 countries, but the study was larger than that. Why the 3 countries? These are some of the largest economies on the continent, and especially regionally, South Africa, Nigeria, and then Kenya in the eastern part of Africa. The study was mainly on sub-Saharan Africa as opposed to the larger continental Africa. But nonetheless, we did a desk review of corporate social responsibility reports under which a lot of the companies report on their corporate employee volunteering. And then we carried out interviews with representatives of nonprofit organizations, especially those are in the space of promoting volunteerism, or those that either as volunteer involving organizations or organizations themselves that are, corporates themselves that and their foundations. And therefore, what I am speaking to today variously draws from all these particular elements. I will not delve too much into a lot of the empirical literature or empirical stuff in terms of what the conversation is about or what I'm presenting, but rather try and make sweeping statements that are in the report itself are supported by a lot of evidence, the empirical evidence that we're talking to. Next slide, please. But whenever you have questions, definitely you feel free to ask them so that if you need more details, we can be able to provide them. So one of the things that we look at in terms of trying to answer the broad question, but also the sub-questions is, what are some of the trends in contemporary corporate volunteering of the African continent? One of the things that we realize, looking at literature, all those particular reports, but also the interviews, is that we have this particular phenomenon occurring at diverse settings and levels for that matter. We have certain countries where corporate volunteering is very, 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 very much developed, at least in the 3 countries that are much of a focus for today's conversation. But more than that, there are also a lot of countries, and I'll be pointing to some of these, where corporate volunteering is still quite nascent. But generally, what we find is both in the more developed and the nascent levels, what has bolstered or bolstered the corporate volunteering has to do with sustained surges GDP growth over the last couple of years or a decade or so. Some of the fastest growing economies in the world are actually African. But more than that, there has been an emergence of new norms of doing business, what Port and Kramer called shared value. So therefore, corporates also would want to contribute in a way to collective prosperity of the continent, as it were. And in so doing, I believe, or we believe in this particular study, that they are in a way also contributing to sustainable futures for Africa. And we will be showing evidence for why we make that particular conclusion in terms of the trends. Next slide, please. The other key thing about corporate volunteering as a trend on the continent is that technology is playing a huge role in enabling corporate volunteering, and we will see exactly how this is happening. However, technology has been tempered by the fact that the internet penetration, for instance, on the African continent is worse than everywhere else on the planet, and therefore, for instance, when you look at the global average, you have 43%. Compared to 67% of the global average of internet penetration. The implication here is that these corporates, even those that are actually involved directly in technology and thrive on technology, like Safaricom in Kenya, or Vodacom, or MTN across the sub-Saharan African countries, is that if there will be cases where they would have loved to use technology, however, they also realize that technology does not deliver what they want. And therefore, they still have to rely on more traditional methods. But where technology is used, you find, for instance, a lot of mentorship, a lot of online volunteering that, for instance, of, let's say, high school, but also sometimes post high school students or people that require a form of mentorship, either in social entrepreneurship or other forms. But more than that, there's also an increase in skills-based employee volunteering. And we find these in various companies across various countries, the three of them differently, but more than that, you also find in Ghana, you also find a lot of that. Especially here, we find a number of very senior company executives actually taking part. With Safaricom, with MTN, with FNB or FirstRand here in South Africa, we find quite a lot of these senior executives who are taking part, sometimes mentoring, either within the companies, but also going outside their own companies to create this. But there's also another emergent strategy, which is companies setting aside specific days or weeks or even a month where they expect their employees to do something in terms of giving back to society or helping solve a particular problem. These will range, for instance, with the Dangote Sustainability Week. Dangote is Africa's richest high net worth individual. His companies variously will have, and there are many of them, have a sustainability week. And what they do is employees go out, do multiple volunteering activities to ensure that they are doing something. You'll find, for instance, in Ghana, MTN devoting a week, is it a week? An entire month actually, to blood donations, for instance, or a specific day in countries like Kenya with Safaricom Foundation with either a day like Shiriki. Shiriki is Swahili for participate, where they incentivize their employees to participate. And these incentives do not necessarily mean that employees get money into their pockets. Sometimes it's matching funds. For instance, if an employee has identified a particular cause that they would want to support, they go out to fundraise for that particular cause, but more than that, sometimes I talked to individuals who talked about every weekend, a particular employee with Safaricom, for instance, going to cater for terminally ill cancer patients in a hospice. So that's not about money, but more than the taking care of them, they would also be fundraising heavily to ensure, and the company would also match whatever employees would have raised in that regard. That becomes an incentive of sorts. So therefore, there's also been a rise in this incentivization as a way of strategy to ensuring more and more employees participate. But in South Africa, for instance, these incentives or recognition has also gone into, for instance, the FirstRand group coming up with a day where volunteerism, corporate volunteerism for that matter, across the country is recognized, and they get awards and trophies for that matter, which become quite interesting in this regard for employees to be able to do more. And this is open not just to employees within their own company, it's open to all corporates that want to participate. Next slide, please. So the critical thing for us is what is influencing these particular trends. We talked about the trend about doing good or shared prosperity, as it were, or shared value. But when you look more critically, especially in the post-MDG era, what we find are a couple of things that are interesting. Some of them starting during the MDG era and some even predating that. One is definitely the UN Global Compact, which uses the same language of shared prosperity and things like that. And therefore, a lot of companies, corporate organizations are saying they need to walk the talk in terms of making positive contributions. of course, SDGs, and we'll find in the next few slides about how these companies sometimes take or pick specific SDGs, and they concentrate on those in terms of their programming and where they would want to participate. But more than that, and we find in various African countries, we find this in Rwanda, for instance, that the picture over there is not necessarily very clear, but that's the president, Paul Kagame, on these Muganda days where everyone is expectant to do some volunteer work. There has been critique around the voluntariness of some of these, or Arambi in Kenya, or Buntu in Southern Africa, or Jamaa. The most important thing in this case is actually companies are being forced, if I may use that loosely, to adapt their CSR strategies and their own standing in society with the various African philosophical worldviews. I am because you are, as the Ubuntu will say, but all these elements say that everyone or every actor has a role to play in making society better, and therefore companies are not left out of this. If you operate on the continent, you need to do this. And one of the easiest ways for companies to be able to be making these particular contributions is not just giving money in forms of CSR or CSI, is to ensure that their employees are probably their best ambassadors. And therefore, when they start employee volunteering schemes, these employees are constantly interacting with members of community or at various levels in their volunteering endeavors. Next slide, please. Okay. I talked about SDGs influencing a lot of the work that companies are doing, and probably this is something of great importance to the webinar, but also I think looking forward to next year's IAVE the Congress. What is happening is that we find specific companies, as I just said a few minutes earlier, picking specific SDGs and then creating programs that specifically target those particular SDGs. In Ghana, for instance, you find within the MTN Ghana that the employee volunteering programs address both SDGs, but they are doing so because there has been, over the last couple of years, a lot of countries have also tried to align their national development goals or challenges that they would want to pursue with SDGs. So therefore, they will say, okay, these are the nation's most pressing goals. And then they look at that and say, okay, these fall under three broad areas for MTA: education, some health, and economic empowerment. And there you'll find various programs or projects that will speak to various elements on these things. In Kenya, we have Safaricom, we have NCBA banking group. Safaricom is a telecommunications company. NCBA is a tech company. Sorry, is a bank. But you also find other banks as when we look at specific case studies of these particular countries. We also have, for instance, Kenya Commercial Bank, but also Cooperative Bank, or who have, in one way or another, concentrating on either particular SDGs, but also in so doing, they are also addressing the nation's development challenges. VIO Society in Kenya, for instance, in one of the interviews, tells us corporate employees are increasingly supporting initiatives that are an empowerment angle, either to individuals or to nonprofit organizations, as well as helping communities meet developmental or humanitarian challenges. Therefore, you'll find a lot of some of the SDG or the goals being captured in what exactly they're doing. And we'll give examples, like I said, a little later. In South Africa, we talked about the Fast Run group. We also have the Discovery group, or Discovery Health for that matter, who are heavily influenced by SDGs. And again, we'll see this We find similar sentiments in Mozambique, in Rwanda, in Malawi, in Zimbabwe, and many other countries that we interviewed specific individuals or looked at company reports, CSR reports for that matter. Next slide, please. Now let's look at three main country case studies or examples. And here we start with Nigeria. Nigeria is Africa's largest economy, and you find that, and we'll speak a little bit about this a little later when we talk about the policy environment. What does it mean? But in the Nigerian case, there's no formal law on CSI that companies need to get involved in CSI by law. But nonetheless, you find a lot of organizations, especially both foreign but also indigenous ones, companies that are involved in or have robust volunteering, employee volunteering schemes. The Dangote one that I talked about is probably one of the largest. You find the brewers also doing a lot. You also find many others. You find bankers like First National, First National, also doing quite a lot in this regard. So what it means for the Nigerian case, and it's similarly shared in Kenya, is that the law on formal volunteering or formal CSI activities, as is the case in, let's say, South Africa or Mauritius, where the law specifically stipulates that companies, those that trade in the national bourse must have a CSI component. It's not the case in a lot of African countries. Actually, all others except for those two that I've mentioned. But nonetheless, other practices have evolved within the sector to incentivize or to make companies start to involve themselves in CSI and specifically on employee volunteering. And many of them will have set areas. When you look at Dangote, for instance, that particular figure on the bottom left, it may not necessarily be very clear, but these are the key sustainable development goals where they are contributing heavily. It's definitely on partnership, doing quite a lot. They are working in partnership with government, with and other stakeholders, including non-profit organizations, in either delivery or in assisting in delivery of various SDGs. But there are also other more specific goals as for 4, 8, 9, 11, 12, and 13. So all of them, you'll find quite a lot that is happening. In the case of First National, what is happening there is they start reaching out through volunteering so that they can teach young people to be kind, and so the employees are actually volunteering in schools and through corporate social responsibility and many other things, teaching young Nigerians on how they can also be able to contribute to their own societies. Next slide, please. The next one is Kenya. And when we looked at Kenya, we find a lot. This is just a few of the examples. The Cooperative Bank, which I mentioned a little earlier. This is the NCBA group, which I mentioned a little earlier. Safaricom, which I mentioned a little earlier. But there's also other groups like Kengen. This is the electricity utility company. They are all doing something, either in tree planting, in taking care of the less fortunate, and many other things. You'll find in Safaricom both a mix of physical volunteering, but also sometimes online volunteering, because it's a tech company or a telecommunications company with a lot of innovations within them or within it that can help. Again, as in the case of Nigeria, we find that regulatory frameworks do not necessarily mean a lot for Kenya in terms of a formal policy from government. However, Kenya has a self-regulatory framework which encourages businesses, those that are socially responsible, to behave in a particular manner. And therefore, you find here that they do not have to wait for government to say, like in the case of Mauritius, 2% post after-tax profit needs to be spent on CSR. They have gone out of their way to make sure that if you're doing good, or you as a company and you're socially responsible, you're a corporate citizen, you need to be doing a better in terms of doing some of these things. So there's a framework which is self-regulatory. Let's look at next slide, which is South Africa. In South Africa, you find a lot. This is probably one of the most developed CSR, but also volunteering programs across the continent. And some of the largest ones are with the FirstRand Group, and they implement through their foundation, FirstRand Group, FirstRand Empowerment Foundation. And they're involved in multiple projects, for instance, the old painting classrooms, but also when you look at the extractive industry, because South Africa has a huge extractive industry, especially minerals. We also have companies like the Anglo-American Platinum, where by law, these particular companies are also supposed to come up with what we call the social labor plan. And that is what gives them the license to operate. This entails negotiating with communities who own the minerals, especially if it's in quote-unquote traditional communities, so that they give certain promises in terms of how they're going to share the wealth. So in the case of South Africa, what you find is CSR, CSI, including the employee volunteering, which is to a large extent shaped by the legal framework. And this probably explains all the growth. There are implications for policy here. If we need to incentivize corporate employee volunteering and CSR more broadly, we probably need these particular laws. However, in literature, the literature is divided in terms of the voluntariness of some of these acts in South Africa and Mauritius, which are the two countries with this particular legal requirement. And therefore, certain people, depending on, especially ideological in this regard, will argue that it's no longer voluntary because it's required by law anyway. Nonetheless, we find that across the continent, other companies where the law does not necessarily require that to happen, still doing it. Actually, MTN, which is originally a South African company, has replicated all their practices in terms of employee volunteering in other jurisdictions where they work, in Rwanda, in Ghana, where we've already mentioned, in Nigeria, etc., etc. So whether they're being quote unquote forced or not in the mother jurisdiction is immaterial. In other cases or in other jurisdictions where they are operating, they are doing it nonetheless. So I think there are other forces at play in this regard. Next slide, please. I think I'm trying to conclude now so that we can have the conversations. So what is happening here is definitely we find an overconcentration of corporate volunteering in companies in South Africa, but also Rwanda, Kenya, Nigeria, and Mauritius. While in Mauritius and South Africa, it's the law that is driving that. Like you've said, in other jurisdictions, companies are trying to adopt to quote unquote progressive ways of doing business. being members of communities where they are, and they need to be socially in good standing to be able to do business, and therefore they are doing quite a lot. And in so doing, they are definitely augmenting government efforts, but also the efforts of other actors in the development process, and especially in meeting sustainable development goals. And you find that this is happening because, as we've just seen, a lot of companies have tailored their employee volunteering objectives so that they meet specific SDGs. The other thing, which is about policy, which I alluded to a little earlier, has to do with, while we may argue that the nascent level of the nascent level of development of corporate employee volunteering in some countries is because of, quote unquote, the lack of clear legal guidelines. I think there are cases where those that do not necessarily have a clear legal requirements can be able to borrow from Kenya, from Nigeria, and say they can be able to do good and contribute to the common good without necessarily having to rely on the big stick of regulation, so to speak. On the whole, I think there are positive pointers to how corporate volunteering is contributing across the continent, even with all the caveats that we mentioned. I think I'll leave it at that so that we have time for conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacob. It's really insightful, and because at the moment we don't have the first question, I will start, and listening carefully while you're doing your presentation. I will start with a very pragmatic approach. Imagine one of the participants now wants to develop a corporate volunteer program in a country in Africa, let's say. What additional or special advice would you give for someone who is starting a volunteer program, a corporate volunteer program, and you can choose one of the countries, your country, then probably you could give a better explanation.
Okay, I think there is an ideological angle into this. Those that believe in coercion will argue that we need laws to be able to make this happen. But others will argue that probably if it is voluntary, the better. In terms of the quality, in terms of the way things happen. But I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all type of scenario. I think given various histories across different countries in the continent, there are some that may probably require that particular law to happen, because especially in the extractive industries, we have a lot of corporate organizations that are doing a lot of extraction with very, very, very minimal returns to local communities. In cases like that, I would argue that having formal frameworks that involve government and requiring corporates to do something would be the way to go. However, in other cases where companies have already started exhibiting a voluntary way of doing that, we probably have seen a lot of, very rich experiences from these scenarios in Kenya, in Nigeria, to some extent. I would argue even in Ghana, in Rwanda. So therefore, I think if you want to, and it's a country where nothing exists, I would actually stand at those that are doing it voluntarily first to see exactly how they've done it, because then that would probably give certain frameworks that can work in the best interest of, I think, communities, but also to some extent the companies, if they want to do it in an impactful manner.
Great, thank you. I was wondering, you were explaining about the SDG, the 17, the number 17, that you approached it in a more direct way. Can you please explain us why? Why is for you that SDG so important?
I think for me, and this particular project tells us this, is that it's about partnership. I think what this particular project does is to give us a sense of how the various actors are quote unquote collaborating in either meeting specific needs of communities without, some will argue that they are going directly into specific, not necessarily 17, but like in the Dangote case, they will highlight 17, but also show you other specific areas where they're also contributing. But what 17 does is to show you that corporates are not saying that they are taking on so many other things. It's to say that we are into partnership with other actors in this particular space in delivering. And I think the partnership orientation of the goal 17 is probably what makes it useful for companies to say, we are not the only ones doing this, and probably being in that particular space that bends or incentivizes or makes it possible for partnership that can be able to deliver is the way to go. I don't know whether I've answered your question.
Yeah, I believe so, yes. And now we have a first question from our audience. Raquel Franco from Portugal asks, I wonder if you could expand on the issue of laws. Can laws coexist with voluntary approaches? What are the disadvantages in establishing laws, in your point of view?
Okay, there's an interesting one, which has to do with something to what I've already alluded to. We have seen laws where these particular exercises become a box-ticking exercise for some companies here in South Africa. Because there's a law and it needs to be adhered to, they just do it without necessarily having to think through or carefully create programs that are probably a long-term or more enduring impact, as it were, without necessarily involving, for instance, community engagement. I have a master's student who just finishing her dissertation, and she's looking at the element of CSR, CSI, and why do CSR, CSI not giving communities, or why do some of the objectives are not aligned to those of quote unquote felt needs of communities? And this is especially in mining communities in one of the provinces here in South Africa. And you find that what's happening in this regard is that this labor social value, those particular plans, labor social plan, that's the name, sorry. What happens is they use existing structures for development planning, which are heavily patronized by the ruling party, sometimes very ineffective, but they do that because they want to tick boxes. Yes, we did this, as opposed to direct community engagement with other actors in those particular communities. And therefore, what they end up with plans that do not necessarily reflect what communities want. They will pour in money that may not, or may, depending on who you're talking to, may not necessarily meet some of these demands. So they will leave communities without, or rather not leave, they will continue pouring money without seeing the results of the money, or communities, certain things. And these students were actually interested in water, the provision of water around mining, rural mining communities. You find there's a lot of water that's used in mining. Rural communities that give their land for mining have absolutely no water, but they may have certain other things which this student says that this particular company, when they are reporting, and it falls under health, but majority of that money was spent in provision of condoms, for instance. And they argue that, yes, it may be around HIV/AIDS and all these other things which are dynamics, but probably this particular community might have gained more if they were given water, potable water, or water that can even be able to have kitchen gardens that can be able to make people have a meal at the end of the day. So it's that misalignment that could happen between what the law wants vis-a-vis the actual practices in achieving what the law wants.
Thanks. We have another question from Cliff Allen. Hi, Cliff. He asked, does the legal requirement on companies to have employee volunteer programs means that individual employees do not have a choice? Is this a formal or informal expectation? And is it the employee time or company time?
I think it's mixed. In many cases, there is an element of quote-unquote voluntariness. And unfortunately, that voluntariness is also contested, because if you, to be a good standing member in our employee, it will be expected that you're doing all these things. So therefore, there may be sanctions against you because you have not been seen to be volunteering or to be doing a lot of the other things, and therefore you're not quote unquote pulling all your weight in terms of ensuring that the companies or the company that you work for is benefiting in one way or another, or is contributing one way or another. But there have also been others where some of the incentives to employees have to do with you're given time off by the company, which is not part of your annual leave or other leaves, so that you can be able to engage in these activities. So it's mixed. And in that case, I think because the company hopes that it's doing good, there is a very thin line between the voluntariness, but also because at least there is a cost to company, because the employee is not necessarily working at that particular time and is not being deducted their work hours at etc. I think it's a good thing that it's happening nonetheless, but it's contested.
Yes, ILO, the International Labour Organization, explains really well the difference between when you're doing the volunteer, the corporate volunteer work in the time that you were working for the company. ILO doesn't consider it volunteering, because it's like your workforce from the company is being used not to having profit, but to help the community, for instance. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic to discuss. So I ask you again, if you have additional questions, you please write them on the Q&A. And there was also the question that Alan asked. It was another thing that I would bring here to the table, let's say. But Cliff already pointed that out. You worked for 20 years in so many regions, and you know the world. What would you say that would be the main differences in this topic that you are talking now, if you have an opinion, what should you say that is more special about the corporate volunteering in Africa?
That's a tough one because when I'm in different parts of the world, I'm not necessarily looking at things the same way. But perhaps let me talk about Asia Pacific, the small island nations in the Pacific, especially Fiji, which I think has a lot of similarities with what I'm describing, the voluntariness of corporates in Fiji in doing some of these things. What I've found interesting in the Fijian case is the establishment of foundations, and these particular foundations become the conduits for the mother body for doing some of these initiatives, or for carrying out these particular initiatives. I think it's a big thing across Africa at the moment. So they become both implementing foundations, but there's also a very thin line between the foundation and the corporate, in the sense that the board members of the foundation, for instance, are our employees, senior employees of the companies and things like that. But as is the case in majority of African countries, there is no specific law that is requiring to do what they're doing. So it's, I think, a level of isomorphism within the industry or within corporates more generally, to say that even if we don't do it now, we're not required to do it. At some point, we may have to do it. And therefore, they have started doing that. I think at the end of it, these companies gain a lot. Last month, I was in a conference in Senegal, and I was talking to, I'll not name the company, but it comes from a corporate foundation. And I was saying, why don't you try and help some of these people in ABC in a particular country? Then after listening to him, and after listening to me, he says, you know, I think the problem with what it's, I think it's a brilliant idea, but that particular idea does not have a way of saying, having a big billboard that says, this classroom or this project was supported by so and so. It's more ideational. And I was asking him, why can't the foundation start funding higher education research on the continent? Then he said, the problem, I think it's great in one way or another, because then it helps us with ideas in terms of programming and all these other things. But unfortunately, ideas do not have the imprints of this was supported by so and so, because at the end of the day, there is an expectation of return, positive return for the company. And I think that does create some of the asymmetries that you're seeing in terms of what to support and what not to support on the continent.
Great. So, and a final question, if you could answer briefly, is from Faustina Abbey. Some corporate employee programs focus on one-off projects that only provide short-term wins. How can we encourage corporates to structure their employee programs towards long-term impacts? I think it's a difficult question, but if we could be brief on that one.
Yeah. I think she's right. Majority of them are into low-lying fruits, so to speak, which can easily. But I think the type of programming that you've seen in some of the companies that I'm talking to, the Dangotes and a few others, where they consider a couple of, let's say, SDGs, I think they start doing work in a more programmatic manner, and therefore they are likely to make certain contributions. On health, for instance, some have gone to support the public in terms of delivering specific health outcomes. So I think therefore there is something that is more calculated. But I've also seen here in South Africa the Discovery Group Foundation, adopting a particular low-income neighborhood and saying, we're going to be working with this particular community for the next 5 years or whatever. And it's not just us, they also bring on board other partners. There, the City Council of Johannesburg comes on board, all other actors that are in this particular space, in Orange Farm, and they are trying to have a very programmatic way, but also a comprehensive community development approach. So, but then, of course, there'll be those that are in and out because it's the day to do so, and things like that. But so it's a mixed bag. I think those that are using a programmatic approach are fewer, but we've started to see that happening. These might be critical lessons for others who may want to do better work.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much, Dr. Jacob. Just to wrap up, the studies of corporate volunteering, as you said, in Africa are very few. However, corporate employees are playing a pivotal role in African societies meeting the SDGs. And the great question that he posed is really needed legislation when given the success in some countries such as Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. It's an amazing question. Portugal is a very good example of that. We have amazing legislation, but in practice, we often don't see how amazing the laws are, and then the practice cases. So it was really amazing. Let's finish then with talking about the next in the Common Good series.
Thanks, Sonia. Yeah, we just wanted to make sure that everybody is aware of the rest of the series as it's coming up. We'll have another session at the end of September, again in October and early November. So if you aren't already registered, please do go ahead and do that. And Sonia, go ahead and wrap up the rest of the session. Thank you.
Yes, that was it. That was my perspective. The things that I pointed out, it was the most striking for me. But of course, I understand that for all participants, you have a different perspective. I hope you enjoy, and I hope to see you in the Q&A and also on the chat in the next webinars. Bye-bye.
Bye, and thank you to everyone.
Hi there. I think that's the only us. I don't know if you want to say something, or should I just leave the Zoom?
Go ahead, Sonia. We're just going to wrap up over here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you,
Bye.
Sonia. Thank you, Sonia.
Bye.
Bye.